The end of occupation did not bring clarity. It brought uncertainty, fear, and a new struggle over power. Across Europe, resistance movements had survived years of terror, scarcity, and constant danger. Civilians who refused to accept occupation built underground networks that sabotaged railways, passed intelligence, hid fugitives, and carried out assassinations, often knowing that a single mistake meant torture or death. In places where governments collapsed and armies disappeared, these movements filled the vacuum. They enforced order, delivered food, punished collaborators, and kept communities functioning when the state no longer existed. During occupation, that role gave resistance movements moral authority. They were not simply fighting an enemy, they were standing in for everything that had failed. Liberation changed the meaning of that authority almost immediately. As Allied armies advanced through Europe in 1944 and 1945, resistance fighters expected their sacrifices to matter politically. Years spent in hiding, years of executions and reprisals, years of operating without protection or recognition had created an assumption that the people who fought would have a say in what followed. Many believed liberation would turn underground movements into the foundation of a new political order. That expectation collided with reality. Once Allied forces arrived, priorities shifted away from disruption and toward control. The same independence that had made resistance movements effective under occupation now unsettled the governments and commanders responsible for restoring order. Armed groups that answered to no central authority no longer looked heroic, they looked unpredictable. Power needed to be consolidated. Allied planners understood that a functioning state depends on one thing above all else: a monopoly over force. Weapons, policing, and military authority had to be centralized quickly to prevent chaos. Resistance movements challenged that principle by their very existence. They had grown outside formal command structures, relying on local loyalty rather than institutional legitimacy, and that imbalance threatened the rapid restoration of state authority. Legitimacy itself became a problem that could not be ignored. In many liberated regions, resistance fighters enjoyed deeper trust than returning officials. Communities remembered who had protected them, who had punished collaborators, and who had taken risks when no one else would. By contrast, many pre-war politicians and administrators returned behind Allied lines carrying legal authority but little moral credibility. That contrast unsettled Allied governments that needed stability built on law and continuity rather than on popular allegiance forged through violence. Local trust was powerful. Central control mattered more. Ideology sharpened those concerns. Across occupied Europe, left-wing movements played a leading role in resistance. Communists and socialists often provided discipline, organisation, and willingness to endure losses when conventional armies collapsed. Those qualities made them effective underground, but they also produced political strength after liberation. Wartime success translated into popular support. And popular support raised the possibility that resistance movements could reshape national politics. That possibility alarmed Allied planners already thinking about the balance of power after the war. Liberation did not simply end one conflict, it exposed the next one. Another fear grew quietly beneath the surface: precedent. Allowing resistance movements to retain arms and autonomy after liberation would send a message that power could exist permanently outside the state. That message could spread. Militias might refuse to disband, rival authorities could claim legitimacy, and fragile post-war societies might fracture before they stabilized. With cities destroyed, economies ruined, and millions displaced, Allied leaders saw little margin for error. Fragmentation looked more dangerous than injustice. Violence weighed heavily on these calculations. Resistance warfare relied on methods that were brutal by necessity. Sabotage, assassinations, and reprisals blurred moral boundaries even when directed against occupiers. Once liberation arrived, those habits did not vanish. In several regions, resistance fighters targeted collaborators, suspected traitors, and political opponents, sometimes pursuing revenge under the language of justice. That behaviour frightened commanders responsible for keeping the peace. Unchecked retaliation risked spiralling into civil conflict, especially in societies already torn apart by years of occupation. Allied authorities wanted calm streets, predictable governance, and rapid normalisation. Resistance movements were built to disrupt systems, not stabilise them. Peace demanded restraint. Restoring the state became the overriding goal. Post-war plans relied on ministries reopening, courts functioning, police forces patrolling, and regular armies enforcing order under recognised governments. Resistance movements existed outside all of those structures. Integrating them fully would have required reshaping the state itself, transferring legitimacy from institutions to movements forged in crisis. That was not the objective. Continuity with adjustments mattered more than transformation. Governments in exile returned. Administrative systems resumed work. Pre-war elites reappeared, sometimes damaged but still influential. Resistance fighters were expected to dissolve back into civilian life or accept subordinate roles within structures they had once replaced. Fear of uncontrollability lingered beneath every decision. Resistance movements had already proven they could survive without permission, organize without oversight, and act decisively without institutional backing. Those traits inspired admiration during occupation and anxiety afterward. Allied planners worried about populations accustomed to defying authority at a moment when rebuilding required compliance with rationing, reconstruction programs, and economic controls. Heroes who questioned power posed a problem. Citizens who accepted it were easier to govern. Across Europe, the pattern repeated. Resistance fighters were ordered to disarm. Weapons caches were seized and units dissolved under Allied supervision. Public ceremonies praised resistance symbolically through medals, speeches and parades, while real authority flowed elsewhere. The contrast was deliberate. Sacrifice would be honoured, independence would not. Integration happened selectively. Some resistance members entered police forces or military units, but ideological reliability mattered more than wartime service. Movements aligned with Allied priorities received temporary tolerance. Others were marginalised quickly. This approach followed a clear logic. Resistance movements represented an alternative source of authority rooted in action rather than administration, in sacrifice rather than legality. Liberation exposed a contradiction that victory alone could not resolve. Resistance had been encouraged to weaken occupation, but it was no longer welcome once occupation ended. War rewarded disruption. Peace demanded control. That shift defined the post-liberation moment. For resistance fighters, the transition felt abrupt and disorienting. Years of danger had produced expectations that liberation would validate their role. Instead, they discovered that victory belonged not to those who fought in secrecy, but to those who controlled institutions. Liberation did not erase power struggles. It relocated them. The same people who had kept societies alive under occupation now stood outside the structures rebuilding those societies. Their courage was remembered, their independence was feared, and their influence was quietly curtailed as Europe moved from war toward a peace shaped as much by anxiety as by gratitude. Liberation did not arrive as a clean break between war and peace. It arrived with orders, deadlines, and a rapid tightening of control. Even before many occupied cities were fully secured, Allied commanders were already acting on plans that treated resistance movements as a temporary wartime necessity rather than a permanent part of the post-war order. The question was not whether resistance fighters would keep their weapons, but how quickly those weapons could be taken away. The guiding idea was simple and uncompromising. Once liberation began, armed power had to belong to the state alone. Resistance movements complicated that goal because they existed precisely outside state authority. Their strength came from secrecy, local loyalty, and the ability to act without permission. During occupation, those qualities made them effective. After liberation, the same qualities made them unacceptable. The first step toward dismantling resistance movements came through classification. Allied authorities rarely treated resistance fighters as regular soldiers. Instead, they were labelled as irregular forces, auxiliaries, or temporary allies, terms that carried legal weight even if they sounded administrative. Those labels placed resistance groups outside the protections and privileges granted to recognised armies. Paperwork replaced sacrifice. Groups that could demonstrate clear ties to Allied command structures or governments in exile found themselves treated more favourably. Movements that had acted independently, even when they controlled large territories or enjoyed mass support, were treated with suspicion. Wartime effectiveness mattered less than bureaucratic alignment. That distinction shaped everything that followed. Once areas were secured, weapon collection began almost immediately. Orders were issued requiring resistance fighters to surrender arms within fixed timeframes, sometimes measured in days rather than weeks. Collection points appeared in towns that had only just emerged from occupation. Compliance was expected, not negotiated. Weapons that had been hidden for years were suddenly demanded all at once. For many fighters, those weapons were not just tools, they were proof of survival. Rifles, pistols, and explosives represented years of risk, supply shortages, and constant fear. Handing them over felt less like a procedural step and more like surrendering hard-earned autonomy. Refusal carried consequences. Allied troops conducted searches for hidden caches, sometimes moving house by house, dismantling networks built under enormous pressure. Resistance leaders who hesitated faced detention or arrest, and in some cases force was used to ensure compliance. The imbalance of power left little room for negotiation. The message came through clearly. The war was over and independence had expired with it. Organisational dismantling followed close behind. Resistance units were ordered to disband formally, their command structures dissolved and communication networks shut down. Meetings were prohibited. Orders were issued instructing fighters to return to civilian life, often without clear guidance on employment, compensation or recognition. The transition was framed as voluntary. In practice, it was enforced. Groups that attempted to remain organised or politically active drew immediate attention from security services. Surveillance increased. Informants appeared inside former networks. Resistance leaders Others who tried to speak publicly found themselves labelled disruptive or dangerous. Resistance was welcome as memory, not as movement. Selective integration offered a narrow path forward. Some resistance members were absorbed into police forces, intelligence services, or newly reorganised military units. These opportunities, however, were tightly controlled. Ideological reliability mattered more than wartime contribution. Fighters deemed politically acceptable advanced. Others, regardless of bravery or leadership, were excluded quietly. Integration acted as a sorting mechanism. Those who fit the emerging order were rewarded with positions. Those who did not were pushed aside. Public narrative helped reinforce this process. Ceremonies, speeches, and monuments celebrated resistance in broad terms, emphasizing unity and sacrifice while avoiding present-day influence. The story of resistance was pushed safely into the past, detached from living organizations and political demands. That shift mattered deeply. By turning resistance into history rather than a continuing force, Allied authorities removed its ability to shape the present. Fighters could be honored without being heard. Legal pressure soon followed. Actions carried out during occupation, including assassinations and sabotage, were reviewed under post-war legal standards. In some cases, resistance fighters faced prosecution for acts that had once been encouraged or at least tolerated. The same behaviour moved from necessity to liability with the change in political context. Enforcement was selective. Those aligned with restored governments often received protection, while critics of the new order found themselves exposed to investigation. Law became a tool for narrowing political space rather than simply delivering justice. Economic pressure compounded these effects. Post-war societies faced shortages, unemployment and housing crises, and former resistance fighters often found themselves at the back of the line. Benefits granted to regular soldiers did not always extend to irregular fighters. Compensation arrived slowly or not at all. Jobs favoured those with pre-war credentials or political connections. Economic insecurity weakened resistance far more effectively than arrests alone. Survival demanded attention. Activism became a luxury few could afford. Surveillance filled the remaining gaps. Security services monitored former resistance networks closely, tracking meetings, correspondence and associations. As Cold War tensions hardened, suspicion intensified, particularly toward movements with left-wing roots. Networks that had once fought fascism appeared in intelligence files as potential threats to stability. The enemy label shifted, but the scrutiny remained. International coordination strengthened this approach. Allied governments shared intelligence and aligned policies across borders, preventing resistance fighters from finding refuge by crossing into different zones. Suppression in one area meant isolation everywhere. There were no safe havens left. Coordination ensured uniformity. Symbolic displays of authority completed the transition. Regular troops paraded through liberated cities. Police checkpoints appeared. Administrative offices reopened with visible Allied backing. These displays signalled that centralised authority had returned and that irregular power no longer belonged in public life. Civilians understood the message as clearly as former fighters did. The disarming of resistance movements did not come from personal resentment or spite. It reflected a calculated effort to reassert control at a moment when authority felt fragile. Allied planners believed that allowing armed movements to persist would invite instability, fragmentation and renewed violence. From their perspective, resistance had served its purpose. It disrupted occupation, weakened enemy control and assisted liberation. After that point, it became a risk. Memory preserved resistance as heroic, but policy stripped it of power. History would praise the fighters, while institutions moved forward without them. For many resistance members, the experience felt like erasure. Years of danger and sacrifice led not to influence, but to silence. Courage earned medals, not authority. Independence gave way to compliance. The transition exposed a harsh reality. Victory did not belong to those who fought unseen. It belonged to those who controlled institutions. Disarmament was only the beginning. Once weapons were gone, resistance movements faced a deeper challenge, one that targeted their legitimacy rather than their firepower. The next stage focused on neutralizing them politically, dividing their leadership, and redefining them in ways that made exclusion appear necessary rather than cruel. Once resistance movements were disarmed, the struggle did not end. It changed shape. Weapons had been taken, units dissolved, and command structures broken apart. Yet one problem remained unresolved for Allied authorities and restored governments. Resistance movements still carried legitimacy, and that legitimacy did not disappear simply because rifles were surrendered. During occupation, legitimacy came from action. People trusted those who fought, organized, and protected communities when no state existed. That trust did not vanish when Allied troops arrived. In many towns and cities, resistance resistance leaders still commanded respect that exceeded anything returning officials could claim. For the post-war order, that was unacceptable. Authority now had to rest on law, institutions and international recognition, not on memories of courage earned in the shadows. Resistance legitimacy competed directly with that goal, which meant it had to be weakened, redirected or destroyed. The process began with division. Resistance movements were rarely unified organizations. They were coalitions formed under extreme pressure, held together by a common enemy rather than shared long-term goals. Nationalists, communists, socialists, regional groups and independents often operated under the same umbrella during occupation. Liberation exposed those differences. Allied authorities understood that unity made resistance dangerous while division made it manageable. Moderate factions were encouraged and praised. Radical factions were isolated and labelled irresponsible. Leadership disputes were quietly amplified through selective recognition and access to resources. Unity dissolved faster than force ever could. Once fragmented, resistance movements lost their ability to act collectively. Groups that had fought side by side began competing for legitimacy, protection and survival within the new political environment. Criminalization followed. Acts that had been tolerated, encouraged or quietly supported during occupation were reclassified under post-war law. Assassinations, expropriations and summary justice were no longer framed as necessities of war. They were examined as crimes. Prosecutions began, not universally and not fairly, but selectively. Resistance members aligned with restored governments or allied priorities often avoided scrutiny. Those who criticised the new order or demanded deeper reform faced investigation. Law enforcement did not apply rules evenly, it applied them strategically. Legal pressure stripped resistance of moral clarity. What had once been framed as courage was recast as recklessness. What had once been survival was reframed as criminal excess. Public perception shifted gradually but decisively. Narrative control reinforced this shift. Official histories began to change tone. Resistance continued to be praised in broad, sanitised language, but its complexity disappeared. Radical demands, internal debates and political goals were removed from public memory. Resistance became a symbol rather than a movement. Textbooks, ceremonies and speeches emphasized unity and sacrifice while avoiding questions of power. Living resistance leaders found themselves absent from decision-making even as their images appeared on commemorative plaques. The story became safe. Administrative exclusion made that safety permanent. Former resistance members applied for positions in civil service, law enforcement or government ministries and were rejected quietly. Files noted concerns about reliability, background or political views. Explanations were rare. Authority returned to familiar hands. Pre-war professionals, administrators and technocrats filled posts that resistance fighters had expected to help shape. Wartime service did not translate into institutional power. Economic pressure deepened the marginalization. Access to jobs, housing and credit depended increasingly on alignment with post-war authorities. Former resistance members who pushed for accountability or reform found themselves sidelined economically. Employment remained unstable. Benefits were delayed. Opportunities closed without explanation. Financial insecurity replaced political momentum. Surveillance ensured compliance. Security services monitored former resistance networks closely, tracking meetings, correspondence and associations. As Cold War tensions intensified, suspicion hardened, especially toward movements with left-wing roots. Networks that had once fought fascism were now watched as potential sources of instability. Organization became risky. Public activity attracted attention. Private gatherings raised suspicion. Trust eroded as informants appeared inside former circles. International signalling completed the isolation. Allied governments made clear which resistance movements they considered legitimate partners and which they did not. Exile governments returned with international backing, while resistance groups lacking that recognition were sidelined regardless of local support. Global legitimacy overruled local authority. For post-war states, recognition mattered more than gratitude. Controlled remembrance sealed the transformation. Monuments, anniversaries and official ceremonies honoured resistance sacrifice without acknowledging its political demands. The memory was curated carefully, stripped of controversy, and framed as a completed chapter rather than an unfinished struggle. By shaping how resistance was remembered, authorities shaped how it could be used. Public exhaustion helped this process succeed. After years of war, occupation, and deprivation, many civilians wanted stability above all else. Continued mobilization felt dangerous. Calls for transformation sounded like threats to fragile peace. Resistance fighters who spoke of unfinished business found fewer listeners. Fatigue favoured authority. By the late 1940s, most resistance movements had been neutralised without mass repression. Their leaders were divided, their organisations dissolved, and their legitimacy reframed as historical rather than political. Sacrifice was acknowledged, influence was denied. The Allies believed this outcome was necessary. They feared that empowering resistance movements would destabilise fragile states, provoke ideological conflict, and risk renewed violence. Order mattered more than fulfilment of wartime promises. That choice narrowed the range of possible futures. Resistance movements had represented alternatives not only to occupation but to the systems that failed before it. By sidelining them, post-war authorities limited how far democracy could reach and how deeply it could change society. Democracy returned. Transformation did not. For the men and women who had fought without uniforms or protection, the realization was bitter. Victory did not reward independence, it punished it. Legitimacy earned through sacrifice gave way to legitimacy granted by institutions, and in places where resistance refused to accept that outcome, where movements retained mass support or demanded real power, marginalization turned into suppression. In those cases, the post-war order did not merely sideline resistance, it crushed it. In most of Western Europe, resistance movements were weakened quietly through disarmament, division and exclusion. In a smaller number of places, that approach failed. Where resistance groups remained organised, armed and politically confident, the response hardened. Suppression replaced accommodation. The turning point came when resistance movements combined three elements that post-war authorities could not tolerate at the same time: armed capacity, mass support and a political vision that challenged the restored order. When all three were present, marginalisation was no longer enough. Power had to be broken. The first warning sign for Allied planners was the emergence of dual authority. In several regions, resistance movements had not only fought occupiers but governed in their absence. They ran local administrations, enforced rules, organised courts and provided food distribution during occupation. Liberation did not automatically erase that structure. In some areas, resistance leaders still exercised real control over daily life. That situation terrified officials tasked with restoring the state. Dual authority meant competing legitimacy, and competing legitimacy meant uncertainty. A government cannot function if people obey different commands depending on who they trust more. Ultimatums followed. Resistance groups were ordered to disarm fully, dissolve their structures and submit to restored state authority. Compliance would bring recognition and protection. Refusal would bring consequences. In many cases, resistance fighters resisted, not because they wanted endless conflict, but because surrender meant abandoning everything they had built and accepting a future shaped by institutions they no longer trusted. Years of underground survival had taught them that authority could fail, flee, or betray communities. Submission did not feel like peace, it felt like erasure. Ideology made compromise even harder. Some of the most powerful resistance movements leaned openly left, advocating land reform, worker control, or deep purges of collaborators. These demands frightened Allied governments who wanted continuity with adjustments, not wholesale restructuring. Revolution was not part of the post-war plan. As early Cold War tensions began to surface, resistance movements with socialist or communist leadership were viewed through a new lens. Wartime allies became potential liabilities in an emerging global struggle. Containment began before the Cold War had a name. International signalling played a critical role in the decision to suppress resistance by force. Allowing one resistance movement to reshape post-war power would send a message across Europe that armed legitimacy could override state authority. That precedent could not be allowed. Suppressing resistance in one country discouraged similar movements elsewhere. It clarified the boundaries of acceptable change and reinforced the idea that post-war stability would be managed from above. Greece exposed this logic with brutal clarity. Greek resistance forces had liberated large areas of the country before Allied troops arrived. They enjoyed mass support, controlled territory and maintained organised armed units. They also leaned heavily left. Drawing strength from years of disciplined underground warfare, when liberation came, Allied authorities backed the return of the pre-war government and monarchy. Resistance fighters were ordered to disarm. They refused. What followed was confrontation rather than compromise. Clashes erupted in the streets. Force replaced negotiation. Resistance units were attacked, disbanded and hunted. What began as a dispute over authority escalated into civil war. The choice was explicit. State restoration mattered more than resistance legitimacy, even when that legitimacy came from years of sacrifice. Greece was not an isolated case. In Italy, resistance movements were pressured aggressively to surrender arms and dissolve, especially factions that pushed for deeper political change. In France, more radical resistance elements were sidelined rapidly, their influence diluted as the restored state consolidated power. Elsewhere, suppression took quieter forms, but the outcome remained the same. Where resistance threatened to reshape power fundamentally, tolerance ended. Control of violence lay at the heart heart of these decisions. Resistance warfare normalized political violence under conditions of occupation. After liberation, that normalization frightened governments attempting to establish order. States cannot function without a monopoly on force, and resistance movements represented an alternative model of legitimacy rooted in armed action. Suppressing resistance restored that monopoly. Even when resistance violence had been directed exclusively at occupiers, its continuation after liberation was framed as criminal, destabilizing, or extremist. The moral frame shifted quickly. Yesterday's fighter became today's agitator. Civilian exhaustion made suppression easier. After years of war, deprivation and fear, many civilians wanted calm more than justice. Food, housing and security mattered more than settling accounts or reshaping society. Resistance movements that continued mobilizing appeared to threaten fragile peace. Authorities exploited that fatigue. Suppression was presented as protection, not punishment. Stability was framed as relief rather than control. Legal systems followed force. Emergency laws were passed retroactively. Courts validated arrests and prosecutions. Actions taken during suppression were legalized after the fact, ensuring that power appeared orderly even when it was imposed violently. Legality followed victory. International silence completed the process. Allied governments rarely criticized one another's handling of resistance movements. Interference would invite scrutiny of their own policies. Silence became mutual and strategic. No one wanted questions asked too closely. Memory management ensured long-term control. In countries where resistance was crushed, official histories minimized its role or reframed it as chaotic and dangerous. Emphasis shifted to national unity, reconstruction and continuity. Conflict within liberation was erased. The story became clean. The result was a post-war order that rewarded obedience and punished autonomy. Resistance movements had proven that ordinary people could organize, govern and fight effectively without state structures. That lesson frightened those rebuilding states. The fear was not of resistance itself, but of what it revealed. It showed that authority could be replaced, that legitimacy could be earned outside institutions, and that crisis could produce alternatives. Crushing resistance was about preventing those alternatives from surviving. The Allies did not suppress resistance out of vengeance. They suppressed it to prevent transformation. Liberation was allowed, revolution was not. The war destroyed regimes. The peace restored systems. Anyone who challenged that restoration, even in the name of justice, was pushed aside, silenced or destroyed. This was not accidental or hypocritical. It was deliberate restraint. Stability mattered more than possibility. The consequences of that choice did not end with suppression. They shaped politics, memory, and trust for decades. Resistance movements disappeared from power, but the questions they raised did not vanish. They waited, and they would return. Long after the last weapons were taken in the form of political unrest, generational anger, and unresolved debates about what victory was supposed to mean. When suppression ended resistance on the ground, it did not end resistance as an idea. That cost would emerge slowly, shaping the fragile peace that followed. The sidelining of resistance movements did not end when weapons were collected and leaders were pushed aside. Its effects spread quietly through post-war societies, shaping politics, trust and memory for decades. What disappeared was not only power. What disappeared was an alternative future. Resistance movements had mobilized ordinary people in extraordinary ways. Farmers, factory workers, students and clerks learned how to organize, govern locally, enforce rules and survive without a state. During occupation, those experiences were not theoretical. They were daily realities. Communities functioned because resistance networks stepped into the void left by collapse. After liberation, that experience should have expanded democratic possibilities. Instead, it was contained. Post-war democracy returned through familiar institutions, parliaments, ministries, courts and bureaucracies that often resembled their pre-war forms. Resistance legitimacy, which came from action rather than procedure, had no place in that framework. Authority flowed from law and international recognition, not from sacrifice or local trust. Democracy survived, its scope narrowed. This narrowing created a legitimacy gap that never fully closed. In many countries, restored governments struggled to command the same moral authority resistance movements once held. People respected the law, but they remembered who had protected them when the law vanished. That memory did not disappear just because institutions returned. Trust became fragile. Citizens complied, but belief weakened. Participation declined. Politics felt distant, administrative, and disconnected from lived experience. The people who had risked everything during occupation now watched from the margins as decisions were made without them. Memory played a critical role in managing that tension. To preserve stability, resistance was transformed into myth. Official narratives emphasized bravery, unity, and national pride while stripping resistance of its political demands and internal conflicts. Ideological debates, calls for reform, and accusations against collaborators faded from public storytelling. Resistance became safe. Monuments honored sacrifice. Anniversaries celebrated courage. Schoolbooks simplified amplified complexity. What disappeared was the question of what resistance fighters had actually wanted after liberation. That erasure mattered. Resistance movements had often demanded deep change, land reform, economic redistribution, punishment of collaborators, and new social contracts. By sidelining resistance, post-war authorities sidelined those demands as well. Reform slowed, compromise replaced transformation, stability improved, inequality remained, continuity emerged as the dominant principle. Despite wartime collapse, many elites survived the transition. Administrators returned to offices, industrial leaders adapted to new conditions, bureaucratic cultures resumed familiar patterns. Resistance had threatened this continuity by questioning who deserved authority after failure and collaboration. Suppressing resistance protected institutional memory, but it also protected institutional blind spots. Problems resistance fighters identified during occupation were left unresolved. Accountability was partial. Justice was uneven. The opportunity for renewal passed quietly. Political danger was redefined in the process. After liberation, dissent increasingly carried the label of instability. Protest looked suspicious. Organisation outside formal parties raised alarms. Security services monitored activism closely, drawing lessons from wartime underground networks. Resistance habits became warning signs. Secrecy, discipline, and loyalty, once celebrated, were now treated as threats. The same skills that kept movements alive under occupation justified surveillance under peace. Moral clarity blurred. World War II created a stark division between right and wrong. Occupation was evil. Resistance was necessary. Post-war suppression complicated that clarity. When resistance fighters were arrested, prosecuted, or marginalized, victory lost its clean edges. For many, disillusionment followed. The meaning of liberation became harder to explain. Generational consequences emerged slowly. Younger generations inherited simplified stories of resistance and restoration. Decades later, when suppressed histories surfaced, anger followed. Student movements, labor unrest, and political protests in later decades drew energy from rediscovering what had been excluded. The reckoning arrived late. It arrived because unresolved questions do not disappear. Cold War politics amplified these effects. By neutralizing resistance movements, especially those with left-wing roots, Allied governments shaped the ideological balance of post-war Europe. Party systems hardened, labour movements were constrained, policy options narrowed, containment operated at home as much as abroad. The peace that followed proved durable but restrained. Europe stabilised, reconstruction advanced, democratic institutions endured. At the same time, that stability rested on limits placed on popular power and political imagination. The price of calm was depth. Resistance movements had shown that people could act collectively under extreme pressure, organise without permission, and demand accountability when institutions failed. By sidelining them, the post-war order taught a lasting lesson. Sacrifice did not guarantee voice. Courage did not guarantee influence. Authority flowed downward from institutions, not upward from experience. Those lessons shaped political culture for generations. They influenced how citizens viewed the state, how governments treated dissent, and how memory was curated to avoid discomfort. The fear of resistance after liberation reveals a paradox at the heart of victory. The people trusted to fight for freedom were not trusted to shape it. Liberation restored order. It did not fulfill the possibilities created by resistance. That unresolved tension lingered beneath post-war prosperity and stability. It resurfaced during crises, protests, and moments when citizens questioned why systems built after victory felt distant and inflexible. The sidelining of resistance did not produce immediate collapse. It produced a peace that worked but never fully healed, and that unfinished business would shape how societies remembered the war, judged their leaders, and struggled to reconcile sacrifice with authority long after the last occupation ended. When the war ended, victory appeared complete. Armies advanced, flags changed, and governments returned. Yet beneath that surface, something remained unsettled. The fear of resistance after liberation exposed the limits of Allied victory. Resistance movements had proven a dangerous truth. Ordinary people, acting without permission, had organised, governed, and fought effectively when states collapsed. They had survived without institutions, replaced authority when it vanished, and earned loyalty through action rather than law. That experience could not be erased simply because the war was over. It lingered. For Allied governments and restored states, this posed a problem that military success alone could not solve. How does authority reassert itself after people have learned they can live without it? The answer was control. Resistance movements were praised for their sacrifice, but they were never trusted with the aftermath. Their courage was honoured symbolically, while their independence was treated as a threat. Memory became a substitute for power, allowing governments to celebrate resistance without allowing it to shape policy. This was not confusion or hypocrisy, it was strategy. Post-war stability depended on predictability. Governments needed to be recognised internationally, economies needed to be managed centrally, and security forces needed clear chains of command. Resistance movements represented uncertainty legitimacy in every one of those areas. They operated outside institutions, answered to local loyalties, and carried political visions shaped by crisis rather than compromise. Those visions frightened planners trying to rebuild order. Restoration mattered more than transformation, even when restoration meant empowering institutions that had failed before the war, or sidelining people who had acted when those institutions disappeared. The post-war order chose continuity with adjustments, not reinvention from below. That choice shaped everything that followed. States stabilized, but they did so cautiously. Democracies returned, but within boundaries. Prosperity arrived, but unevenly. Political systems endured, but they left many voices outside their walls. The cost of that stability was not immediate violence, it was unresolved tension. Resistance movements had demanded accountability, justice, and change that went beyond survival. By suppressing those demands, the post-war order postponed confrontation with deeper problems. Postponement worked for a time, as reconstruction and growth softened discontent, but unresolved conflicts do not disappear. They wait. Decades later, protests, political upheaval, and crises of legitimacy echoed questions first raised when resistance fighters were pushed aside. Why did sacrifice not translate into voice? Why did institutions return unchanged after failure? Why did peace feel controlled rather than shared? Those questions did not emerge from nowhere. They trace back to choices made in 1945. The fear of resistance reveals that Allied victory carried moral and political limits. The Allies defeated fascism, rebuilt Europe, and prevented immediate collapse. They also defined strict boundaries around acceptable change. Understanding this does not diminish the scale of that achievement, it clarifies it. Peace was not simply the absence of war. It was a settlement between order and possibility, stability and justice. In that settlement, order won. Resistance movements were not defeated by the Nazis, they were outlived by the peace. Their ideas survived in memory, protest and delayed reckoning long after their organizations were dismantled. The people who fought without uniforms discovered that victory rewarded institutions, not independence. World War II did not end with a clean moral resolution. It ended with decisions about prisoners, economies, justice and resistance that shaped the modern world quietly and deliberately. Those decisions created stability, but they also carried costs that were unevenly borne and rarely acknowledged. Victory ended the fighting. It did not end the struggle over who decides the future. That struggle simply moved from battlefields to ministries, from weapons to laws, and from resistance cells to controlled memory. The war was over, but the question of power remained unresolved, shaping the peace that followed and the world that still lives with its consequences. The arc ends here, but the questions it raises do not. If this series changed how you understand the end of World War II, then stay with the channel. WW2 Declassified focuses on the decisions made after the fighting stopped, the choices buried in reports and policies, and the quiet compromises that shaped the modern world. Subscribe to continue following these long-form investigations into power, memory and consequence. And if you want to support this work directly, you can do that on Patreon. Your support helps keep these documentaries independent, research-driven and free from shortcuts. The links are in the description.